everybody to this second seminar for the series of seminars that we are organizing for the Italian Reproducibility Network. And today we will talk about scientific fraud. And here we have Professor Ernesto Carafoli. Professor Ernesto Carafoli was the director of the Biochemical Institute of the Polytechnic of Zurigo, and then was also director of the Istituto Veneto di Medicina Molecolare. He is actually currently a member of the Accademia Lincei. He is among one of the most cited Italian scientists in Italy. Okay, so and it's a great pleasure also to introduce, because I found that Ernesto Carafoli was a classmate of my former advisor and professor Giovanni Bruno Vicario. So it's a great pleasure to introduce him. Today, Professor Carafoli will talk about fraud, and you will see also the research also he has done on fraud and on the fraud market and the scientific black market of scientific communication that's out there. So I leave the word to Professor Carafoli. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for this presentation. And actually, would you said that I'm one of the most widely quoted scientists in Italy, not for what I'm talking about here, however, hopefully. So far, everything was okay with me. Now, I haven't spoken in public for more than 1 year because of COVID emergency. So I don't know that I will have the necessary fluidity in my talk today, but I apologize if I will not be as eloquent as I normally be. So you see, about 40 years ago, an important book was published. This book here by two British authors, Broad and Wade. And this book created a sensation in the scientific community and also in the community, in the public at large, because it had an appendix. In this appendix, there were accusations of fraud against 34 of the most important scientists of the past. I show you the slide of these people. Most of my slides today have a lot of written text. We read them together. And this is why I don't have a pointer with me, because we can read the things together. So you see here you have scientists of the caliber of Ptolemy, of Galileo, the most important scientific Italian icon, as you know. We have Isaac Newton, we have John Dalton, we have Gregory Mendel, and we have Robert Millikan. All these people were accused in this book by different types of fraud, which are listed here. We don't have to go to them in detail. Now, as a matter of fact, this appendix of 34 individuals which were accused of scientific misconduct was a little bit, how should I say, it was sensational, but in hindsight, it was not really so correct. Several people have published papers and even books to somehow discuss the real truth of these accusations. You see, the point was that before this book was published, scientists considered noble individuals, like, religious people who were seeking the truth and nothing else, and they were never able to commit anything wrong in their own activities. Now, this is why this book was a sensation. As a matter of fact, let me tell you, do I have it here? Yes. These scientific frauds by people like Galileo or Newton have been examined in detail by several people. I did it myself. I published a paper or two on this. And as a matter of fact, I would say that with the exception of Ptolemy, analysis done last few years after the book by Brian Wade was published, have actually sort of exonerated most of these people who were accused of wrongdoing in science in the past. With the exception of Ptolemy. Ptolemy, as you know, is the father of the geocentric theory of the universe. The Earth is at the center of the universe, and everything rotates around it, including the sun. Now, that was for 1,500 years the domineering theory of universe until Copernicus came and Galileo and Tycho Brahe and these giants of the Renaissance. Now, Ptolemy was the only one on these authors which I mentioned before, which has been actually considered guilty. He lied on several issues, and the most important issue he lied is when he said that he made observations from Alexandria in Egypt, where he was living, which could have made them because he could see the stars in the way he described them in his own books, in his own papers. They were done by somebody else instead, called Hipparchus, 400 years before Ptolemy. So Ptolemy, he was certainly guilty of fraud, whereas all the others, Galileo, Newton, Dalton, Mendel, etc., somehow has been exonerated of doing by several essays, including some written by me and my co-worker Enrico Bucci. However, in defining, you know, there is a point to be discussed here. Nobody really knows, nobody really knew at least, what really scientific fraud is. And this is why it was a bit questionable when you make accusation against some other scientists. Now, there are some rules. We have here a series of definitions. Research conduct, fraud, and also not only fraud, are defined as fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism, proposing, performing, or reviewing research, or in reporting research results. Fabrication is making up, you can read it with me here, fabrication is making up data or results and recording or reporting them in print. Falsification, manipulating research materials, for example, figures. That is particularly so in some branches of science, for example, in bioscience, where there is an intrinsic variability in the science itself. In manipulating research materials, equipment, processes, or changing or omitting data or results, such as the research is accurately represented in the research record. Plagiarism is a very important point. Is the appropriation of another ideas, processes, results, or words without giving appropriate credit. Now, when we talk about plagiarism, one has to distinguish between plagiarism of results of somebody else or self-plagiarism. Many scientists, every scientist as a matter of fact, publishes papers and he repeats things that's done in a paper, especially in the methods or in some aspect of the discussion. That is self-plagiarism. It is wrong, but not as wrong as when somebody steals actual ideas for somebody else and publishes them as they were his own ideas. Now, in the title of my talk, I also had errors. Now, errors, of course, are something wrong, but they're not is important when they are honest error due to incompetence or sloppiness or whatever. These are not frauds. Therefore, I will not talk about them today, although fraud errors have increased a lot in the last few years. Now, in the procedure now adopted in defining fraudulent activity in science, there are rules, and I have chosen for you here the definition adopted by the US government. In Article 3, and this is an important article, a finding of misconduct requires that there be a significant departure from accepted practices of the relevant research community at the time in which they were occurred. This is important. In the times of Galileo or of Newton or Ptolemy even, there were different conceptions about what is correct and not correct in science. So when somebody discusses fraud now, it's important that he considers that with respect to the rules in the time when it was committed. Therefore now, for example, Ptolemy sure lied. He was guilty for sure, but nevertheless, the power of the religion in those days, the power of the geocentric theory of the universe, so tremendous that it was nearly logical to follow some of what was said without even verifying it. So it's important that the fraud has to be committed, the fraud committed has to be something that is outside the pattern, outside regulation of the times it was committed. Number two, the misconduct be committed, must be committed intentionally or knowingly or recklessly. So it's not really an error. It must be the person who does that must be sure that he is committing fraud. And this is an important point. The allegation of fraud must be proven by a preponderance of evidence. This is an important point. Normally, in regular justice, at least in the Western world, when somebody is found guilty of something, must be found found guilty by a verdict when there is absolutely no doubt. The definition is without any possible doubt that what is done is a fraudulent behavior. In the case of scientific behavior, is different. What one accepts as fraud is something that is evidence of it by the preponderance of evidence. Okay, so this is an important point. Scientific fraud is judged and decided on different from normal criminal behavior in courts and so on and so forth, where beyond any reasonable doubt. That is what they say. Now, I have here, now frauds in the past were actually not common, at least not that we know. And what is remaining in history is the frauds, the supposed fraud committed by very important personalities. In the last few years, for several reasons which we will discuss, there has been an explosion of scientific fraud, not normally on very important topics like the origin of the universe or something like that, but petty items. Frauds are not very common on minor aspects of science. And I don't want to read them with you here. Here I have a list of about 50 or so cases that have become popular in the media, for example. And there are very many, but I've listed some of them. Some of them, the author of some notes were known to me personally, for example. And even not only individuals, but companies. Last issue, see, the last three entries are, the last two entries, 16 and 17, are against companies who have committed fraud. Anyway, just to tell you that scientific misconduct, let us call fraud it from now on, has become much more common. There's been an explosion of it in the last few years with respect to what was rarely happening in the past. And the target of the fraud, the topic of the fraud, normally is a minor thing, not something really tremendously important. Now, let us see now what are the reasons for this tremendous increase of scientific frauds in the last few decades. For example, first one is the general decrease of funds, coupled with the increase in the number of researchers, tendency to publish at all costs. There is a famous sentence here, a famous slogan, or a famous definition: publish or perish. You're in science. If you don't publish, you are out of science. And now publishing has become much more important, much more difficult. Therefore, there is an explosion of tendency to cut corners and commit frauds, more or less. Number two, explosion of research in geographical areas which are no longer underdeveloped, coupled with rules that require publication in international journals to obtain professional degrees, career advancements, and are actually connected with cash bonuses. People are getting cash money for publishing in important journals. Therefore, of course, the tendency to cheat is greater, obviously. Number three, proliferation of open access journals. Now, for you, it's normal now to see open access. You go to the library or you check the internet, is open access journals, which in the last few years have dramatically increased in number. Now there are more than 10,000 open access scientific journals. Here I have in red something else, which is also between frauds and error, the inadequate statistical analysis of the results. This point is particularly important in the biological medical research. So is it fraud, or is it simply incompetence or sloppiness? Difficult to say, because in the bioscience area, there is an intrinsic variability per se, and therefore the limit between fraud and simply inadequate treatment of results is actually difficult to decide on. So on this I will not now publish or perish. In the last few years, the total number of papers published worldwide has more than doubled. It now exceeds 2 million, it's actually more like 3 million now, because this is about 6-7 years old, this slide here. This is so because the number of researchers worldwide has also increased exponentially. Since careers have become increasingly dependent on the publication in high-impact journals, the race to publish has become increasingly competitive. Thus, the incentives to cut corners and commit acts of misconduct or fraud has also increased exponentially. Now it is so that whether you remain in science or ejected from depends on whether you've published 1 or 2 papers in high impact journals. And of course, it's obvious, humans are human beings. If your career depends on that, the tendency of to be a little bit less strict and cut corners is actually also increased. Number 2, explosion of research in areas which are no longer underdeveloped, coupled to rules that require publications in international journals to obtain degrees, career advancements, and cash prizes even. And this, of course, is essentially a case of China. Now, I don't want to misunderstand me. China is a great country. China passes top-level work, top-level research, has done important discoveries, but there are rules there, even now, although now less, as I will tell you, which the amount of misconduct is actually bigger than elsewhere else. In today China, there are about 9,500 academic journals which are published, scientific journals. The scientific journals around 4,000, no, excuse me, there are about 10,000, 9,500 academic journals in science and not science. The scientific journals are about 4,600, only about 200 of them, a small minority, published in English for a paper published in journals of the Science Citation Index, an important index, which are about 4,000, little 4,000. In most universities in China, authors receive a significant cash prize that is for a paper published in top journals like Nature or Science, for example. I'll go back to that in a few minutes. In most of the Chinese universities, scientists are required to publish a number of articles in Science Citation Index journals to be eligible for promotions. And one does not obtain the title of PhD, like you, for example, here, without having published at least 2 papers in Science Citation Index journals. All this creates an enormous pressure to publication. In the first decade of this century, for example, the number of scientific publications in China has increased from about 30,000 to about 200,000. This is the graph of it. And it is now estimated that the number of Chinese researchers who are trying to publish in is close to 3 million people. So an absolutely enormous number of scientists are doing research in China. The journals have increased, but not so much. Therefore, the tendency to somehow be a little less strict than one should be is increased. Now, the phenomenal explosion of research activity in China has created a very serious problem. The pressure to publish has tended to generate a large number of cases of scientific fraud favored by various controversial aspects of the publication procedure in China. Among them, there are exorbitant publication fees requested from journals, quote unquote, journals which are not so honest, that in exchange provide publication without peer review. Number 2, the offer of agencies to write articles for a fee. In China, even now, you can find in the internet offers to write an article for you. You provide the results maybe, but they write the article for you. Or even worse, there are illegitimate journals who distribute bogus prizes. They give you a prize which is non-existent in the fake case, a bogus prize, but of course you can put it on your lapel here or put it in your curriculum, and that is still there. And this is the most important point. The sale of papers. The last aspect of the fraudulent publications now become widespread. I personally, myself, with my colleague Bucci, bought a paper. I gave a title, and I was asked, what do you to us to do? A review article or you want an original article? So I want an original article. How many references do you want? About 20. And how many figures? 4 or 5 and so on and so forth. And believe it or not, I paid for this paper, which was of course invented, $340. That gives you an idea, since the price is very low, of course, as you understand. No? It gives you an idea of the enormous market, and not only in China, but especially in China. This is a paper, if you want to read it, written by a Chinese lady by a Chinese named Mara Ristendal, who had written a paper, you may want to read it, and it describes what I said and a lot more in detail. Now, all this is an important of the point which I mentioned. The most important, perhaps, is the cash for publication policy. Now, the first detailed study of payment to Chinese scientists for publishing in high journals has appeared in 217. In this is the title of the article that appeared in the MIT Technology Review. For many years, rumors had circulated that Chinese scientists were financially rewarded whenever their scientific papers are published in respectable journals. That was well known. As the number of papers published by Chinese scientists has become to skyrocket, these financial rewards have raised serious questions about the credibility of work published with this kind of incentives. And entire integrity of Chinese science has received a blow. But let me tell you, how much money do Chinese scientists receive for publishing a paper in Nature or Science or even PNAS or whatever? There are two researchers, I don't know that they pronounce them well, Wei Quan of Wuhan University, Bei-Kun Chen at Nanjing University of Science and Technology, and then also Fei Shu at McGill University in Canada, have survived the financial incentives offered by most, not by all universities, but most universities, most of the top 100 universities in China, and they've analyzed the data. They found that cash per publication incentives are common, and that scientists who publish in top Western journals can earn in excess of $100,000 per paper. Can you imagine that you are students here, and you publish? They tell you that if you publish a paper in Nature or Science, you get $100,000. Well, you're honest. You're all very honest, but the temptation is there, definitely. If it were $25, one would think, well, that does not matter, but not worth it. But $100,000 changes your life, of course. I don't make any judgment, any comments. Now, actually, we can be the remainder of this slide is here, but I said yes. I want to give you a table now, show you a table which is important. That is actually an analysis of papers published in 8 years between 2008 and 2017 in different journals. All this procedure was initiated by Nanjing University, as a matter of fact. Read this paper here, the essence of the table. A paper in Science, in 2008 gave the first author in Nature of Science about $26,000. And then it has increased, and now they can get $43,000. And the list of prices decreases with the importance of the journal, of course. Now, this paper, this table goes back to 2017. As I said, now I have precise knowledge that scientists in 2020 in some universities receive a prize for a paper published in Nature of more than $100,000, as I just told you. Now, Nature has a very strict publication policy and is actually reviewing the papers very carefully. So publishing a fake paper in Nature is not so easy, but it's not so easy, but the tendency is there. And if it is attempted by 200,000 people, maybe 3 or 4 times it works, so this is the point. Now, the Chinese government has become aware, very, very aware of this problem. The fact is, in many countries, as you see here, if you falsify data, then your career is over. If proven to have committed fraud, you're no longer in science. In China, the cost of cheating is rather low. You're not fined for that. You may not get promoted immediately, but once people forget, you might even have a chance to move up in your career scale. And here, let me tell you about ways and means that have been developed, actually very ways full of imagination. I admire the imagination of the schemes adopted to cheat and get money out of it. For example, schemes have emerged for getting papers into prestigious journals. You all know, you are too young, probably don't know it, but in a few years, you will know that when you will send a paper to a journal, you were asked, please give us the names of 4 or 5 referee who can judge your paper, right? Because so the journal doesn't have to go around, making phone calls and letters and so on. Every author knows he has asked to give the names of some important people, some people who can referee their own work. Well, years ago, what happened is that a very important journal, Tumor Biology, had to retract all of a sudden 107 papers, retract them because they were falsified. And 101 of them were from China. What had happened was the following, that the authors of these falsified papers had responded to the request to provide them 4 or 5 or 6 reviewer, possible reviewer. And they did provide the name of important reviewer like Albert Einstein or Isaac Newton or whatever, but with their own email. So they received from the periodical, I don't know whether it was Nature or not, it was Biology in this case, they received, the author wrote his own or her own review, fantastically beautiful. And the paper was published, except that the referee was false, was invented. I don't know how it was discovered, but as a matter of fact, that Tumor Biology, the periodical, the review, the journal had to retract 107 papers on the spot. Now, there's many other schemes. I will tell you at the end of this talk, other schemes which have been devised. But there are even now, in spite of all these scandals, there is still in China a very flourishing commerce of papers written, invented, and sold for fees like the one I paid myself, which are rather minor. The Chinese government has reacted. In the last 15 years or so, rules have been now put in operation that have substantially decreased this. We don't do this, but now measures have been proposed that tend to correct this anomaly in this science. And stiff punishments are actually even inflicted. For example, there in about 6 years ago, in 2015, China has decided to impose heavier punishments on people involved in scientific scandals, like the ones in the review, in the analysis I've shown you in a couple of slides ago. The government has become aware that has created a lot of feelings in the world on Chinese publication, and they have actually increased punishments to the point, believe it or not, that now in 2017 rules have been approved by the Chinese government. If you invent a paper or falsify a paper or commit fraud anyway in journals that have to do with bioscience, health, and so on and so forth, and if you create problems with health of people or even death of people, then you can even be sentenced to death. So this is actually an absolutely tremendous advancement, even too much, I would say, advancement in the attempt to provide this explosion of scientific fraud that was caused by the several ways of doing science that I've told you in science. I told you in the last few slides. Second point, proliferation of open access journals. I have to do it fast. About 20 years ago, the first open access journals appeared. Now, for you, it's common, but 20 years ago, they were non-existing. The aim was to fight the suffocating dictatorship of leading journals that, in fact, use their power. We know that even now, even to direct science. Big journals now actually help privilege scientific aspects, scientific topics, and they push them. So in a sense, they direct science themselves, which of course is impossible, unacceptable. Now, at variance with the regular journals, which operate on traditional subscription fees paid by institutional libraries and private scientists, open access journals survive on publication fees by the submitting authors. The aim was positive, as you understand, but open access journals, as I said you already in a few slides, rapidly mushroom in a global industry. In 10 years, their number exceeded, and when this analysis was done at a minute, exceeded 8,000, now it's more than 10,000, in which, excuse me, the vast majority of journals became a commercial, predatory system that ignored the essential rules of scientific publication, beginning with honest peer reviewing. Now, an author called John Bohan wrote an article about, it was, I believe, in 10 years ago, something like that, in Science. And this title, Who is Afraid of Peer Review? What has John Bohan done? He published, he wrote a paper he submitted a paper dealing with, to the Journal of Natural Pharmaceuticals under the name of Ocorfo-Comans, a name which was incredibly strange. Even the name itself should have raised some doubt. But anyway, from the Wassi Institute of Medicine in Asmara in Eritrea. He described the anti-cancer properties of a compound extracted from lichens. They were readily accepted by the journal. Well, I have no other, something, my computer is blocked here. What happened here? Maybe there is something electricity. Okay. Comment on John Bohan after his paper was accepted. In fact, it should have been promptly rejected. Any reviewer with more than high school knowledge of chemistry and the ability to understand the basic data plot should have spotted the paper's shortcomings immediately. Its experiments are so hopelessly flawed that the results are meaningless. I know it because I wrote the paper, said John Bohan. Ocorfo-Comans doesn't exist, nor does the Wassi Institute of Medicine in Asmara. Okay. Second comment, over the past months, I have submitted 304 versions of the Wonder Drug paper to open access journals. More than half of the journals accepted the paper, failing to notice its fatal flaws. After a journal accepted my paper, I sent the standard mail to the editor. Unfortunately, while revising our manuscript, we discovered an embarrassing mistake. We see now that there is a serious flaw in our experiment, which invalidates the conclusion, and I then withdrew the paper. He exposed the fraud, which was, of course, promoted by the journal which he has submitted his bogus paper. Except that now, even a sports has developed to repeat what he has done, and many authors have tried to expose the wrongdoing of the predatory journal by submitting fake journals. I have a paper here. I apologize to the audience here because this is actually a bit as a slide, but it is like this. Two American authors have submitted the paper to a review to one of these journals. They were fed up because all of us senior scientists receive every week request to publish a paper in journal so-and-so, even to become member of the editorial board of the journal, and so on and so forth. I receive personally 5 or 6 every week or so for this, but many, you'll have the same experience in a few years. So they were fed up and wrote a paper with this title, get me off your fucking mailing list. I apologize for the quality. This paper was an endless repetition of the first sentence. Here is it, you see, which was accepted by the International Journal of Advanced Computer Technology, which was a predatory journal. It was sent by the two authors in response of this continuous harassment by fake journals to publish paper and so on and so forth. It was rated as excellent, you understand that? Read the abstract of this paper. It even had the figure. Look at the figure here. He had the figure, and it was actually published like that, with the evaluation excellent. And there are, I could quote you, look at this one. Another paper like this was sent to a number of predatory journals. Look at the names of the authors, you know, Pinkerton, LeBrain, and Orson Welles. You're too young to remember Orson Welles. Orson Welles was a very famous movie actor, for example. No? I believe you all know, have heard the name at least. But look, try to read the paper here. It's unreadable. It is a collection of words without sense. Published again. Here I have another one, I'll go fast now, on the mathematical proof to the law of Kant. This paper is full of mathematics, nonsense mathematics like this, you know, accepted. Now, these were, of course, attempts to do wrongdoing, to publish wrong paper for a good purpose, to expose journals which actually are criminal journals. There are other attempts to do something else. There is a famous hoax, a famous trick run by a guy called Sokal. It was a physicist, Alan Sokal, had done something similar to what John Rohannon had done, but for another reason. He didn't want to fool predator access, open access journal. He wanted to find out whether a leading serious North American journal of cultural studies published an article literally salted with nonsense if A, it sounded good, and B, if it flattered the editor's ideological preconceptions. So it was a very serious attempt not to expose fraud, but to expose this sort of politically correct writing in some publications, some journals. The title of the essay was, look at the title, Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity. The article proposed that quantum gravity was a linguistic construct and was accepted and published in May 1996 by the famous journal Social Text. But Sokal had revealed the hoax in a second article he published in the May-June 1996 of Lingua Franca, other journal, in which he wrote that the article had been written for Social Text was a pastiche of left-wing Kant, phoneme references, grandiose quotations, and outright nonsense, structured around the silliest quotation he could find about mathematics and physics. And it was a big scandal. And actually, this is a scandal that has generated another scandal, the so-called Sokal Square hoax. The Social Square hoax was organized in 2018 by 3 US authors, Pete Boghossian, James Lindsay, and Helen Blackrose. They submitted 20 fake papers that used fashionable jargon and reached ridiculous conclusions to high-profile journals that published serious articles even by respected authors in academic fields like postdoctoral postcolonial theory, gender studies, queer theory, critical race theory, intersectional feminism, fat studies, and so on. I'll give you some title so you judge yourself. A title, Human Reaction to Rape Culture and Performativity in Urban Dog Parks in Portland, Oregon. It claimed to be based on in situ observations of canine rape culture and ask whether dogs suffer oppression based on perceived gender. Viewer found the paper to be incredibly innovative, rich in analysis, and extremely well written and organized. Another paper was published in Sex Roles, with an even more grotesque title, Ethnography of Breast Restaurant Masculinity, Themes of Objectification, Sexual Conquest, Male Control, and Masculine Toughness in a Sexually Objectifying Restaurant. These papers are published not in predatory, in journals which actually are sort of a line journal which publish only on topics that satisfy the editors or certain cultural tendencies. But let us go back now to real predatory journals. I have mentioned them several times. Predatory activity consists in publishing papers irrespective of their lack of merit, without the essential peer review, you know what peer review is, I suppose. Screening, provided that the author accepts to pay publication costs that may be very substantial. This is an important point. People working in Padova here, like you in the few years, will never fall in the trap of publishing predatory journal, because you understand easily. But there are, I will show a slide later on, one of the last slides. There are countries at the border of actually developed culture, which this is not known. And these poor people, for people say in paper like Zambia or Paraguay or whatever, $100 is a big amount of money. So there is this additional factor that made this predatory activity absolutely disgusting, that they actually steal money not from people in Padua or New York, but from people living in countries, because they don't understand that yet. You understand? Now, there was a librarian at the University of Colorado of Denver who has drawn a list of journals he deemed to be possible or probable predatory journals. Since the compilations of Bill were somewhat controversial, they were taken offline 1 year later, but are still available in the web archives and are still largely quoted. Now, an important slide now for you. A very recent survey by two authors in Poland have found that 324 journals appear in the list of Bill are indeed listed in Scopus, one of the most important database of journal of publication, with 164,000 articles published in 2 years, between 2015 and 17, up to 3% of the total published paper. Let me clarify that. Scopus, actually, other databases are a little better. Scopus is probably, together with Google, the most important one, publishes 3% of papers in predatory journals, in indexes, papers published in predatory journals. To understand that. That is a fantastic, a terrible finding. You go to Scopus, Google or whatever, find a paper, something interesting, only it's bogus. And you publish your work, you do your work based on this thing. So the level of science decreases. You understand the danger of this thing. Now, here I have a slide for you. I read it carefully, but it is a geographical distribution of a scientific publication in predatory journals. And you see what I told you before. You don't find here Canada or UK or Denmark. You find only countries which are at the border of normal culture, let alone scientific culture. And that is what makes this criminal activity disgusting, because you steal money from people who actually are much poorer than we are, see? So retain this thing, 3% of the most popular data bank of publications are 3% of the listings are listings in predatory journals. Okay, I think it should scare you because it will increase before you reach the age in which you will publish a lot of papers. I have 2 or 3 more slides. Some interesting general point that is a seminar in the School of Psychology. So I believe I should have talked more about why do people commit frauds, psychology of it. I have no time to do that, and actually is not the reason why I talk today. But a few things I want to say. All past cases of fraudulent behavior in science had personal scientific advantages as a rationale. But we must distinguish that there is. I am running, and I still am running in a sense, an important periodical. And 10 years ago, actually, no, not 10 years, 6, 7 years ago, we received a paper by 5 authors from Greece that published in very important papers, except that they evidently read this paper at the Congress by a very prominent molecular biologist from the United States. And their motivation, these 5 authors were non-existing, because after we published that paper in our journal, this, I don't want to make names here, this very prominent US molecular biology called me, a friend of mine, told me, you have published a paper, so-and-so. I said, yes, we did. It was a beautiful paper. Yes, it's a beautiful paper. This is my paper. He said, I gave this data at 2 meetings, and evidently somebody there read what he did. He constructed a bogus paper out of my results, you see. So I called the president of the University of Thessaly in Greece, yes, and he told me people, they asked me, give me some time, called me back, said, these people don't exist, and we have never read these 5 authors in our university. So what was the motivation? This paper was on 2 important topics having to do with diabetes and obesity. And the American molecular biology has applied for a patent. We say brevetto in Italian, a patent on these 2 papers. Now the patent regulations is very complex, and they don't care whether the paper you publish is real or not. As soon as it is published, it's enough to ruin your patent. So the motivation of these people, I believe, behind them probably was some important pharmaceutical company, but behind these 5 Greek, non-existing Greek authors, they simply wanted to ruin the patent of this prominent American molecular biologist. Actually, my journal is published by Elsevier, an important publication, most important publication, scientific publication house. And we started an investigation, and after 2 or 3 months, me back said, professor, forget about it. We never find out. This paper was fabricated in an internet cafe in Shanghai. So we still don't know today who are these these authors. The poor molecular biologist has lost his patent, losing millions of dollars, $1 million literally. And this is it. So this is a new psychological motivation, because normally, you see, people commit fraud. They are even psychologically disturbed people, or people who go for a momentary prize, for example, and then discover. Here, there is an important point. Should research fraud be a crime? An important author, Scott Roeben, Drugs in Orthopedic Surgery, and Eric Perlman, Cardiovascular Risk in Menopause, have been sanctioned 6 months and 1 year in jail respectively because somehow they had to do with health problems, you see. However, Andrew Wakefield, a very important, this is an important person, is the man, maybe you've heard of him. He said that vaccinations are bad because they cause autism. It reminds me of what we are now experiencing in the world, especially in Europe and in Italy, the so-called no fraud, no fraud people who really commit in incredible things. They commit. Somebody, a colleague of mine, asked me a few days ago, he's a no fraud guy, even if he's a professor at the University of Padua. And he told me, do you understand? When they vaccinated, they injected graphene into you. How come that he knew about that? He thought of it is incredible. I don't want to make propaganda for vaccination here, no. But I'm saying that Wakefield had this grotesque idea that vaccination produced autism. It was actually, his results were, the results he had published were proven to be fake. He was fired by the hospital in which he was working. He was expelled by the British Medical Association. Nevertheless, now it's still very popular. Let me skip a slide here. See, here is he goes around making talks, and it is actually receiving enthusiasm by people. He has even made a film. This is the film, you see? He has made a film. Is actually seen it, maybe some of you have heard about it, in which he insists with the most grotesque argument that vaccination is autism. Okay, so it is something reminiscent of what we are experiencing now in Europe, in the US, in the world, as a matter of fact, by people who really believe the vaccinations are even a plot by big pharma, or even by they believe that the COVID doesn't exist. They believe in incredible things without any evidence for it, but they're very popular still. Now, let me go back to the slides here. There are now other people like this guy Macchiarini, who worked at the Karolinska. He said that he was a friend of the Pope, and he had convinced the fiancée that the Pope would marry himself. The Pope himself was fake, of course, and he was filed by Karolinska, but he's not in jail because nobody really knows, unless it is a matter of human health, how to process actually scientific fraud. Is it a crime or not a crime? I have here, as a matter of fact, an important meta-analysis made in the US of scientists in which they were asked if they have committed research misconduct. It's revealed that 2% admitted to have fabricated, falsified, or modified data at least once. The motivation was always to publish a paper in important journals or to obtain a grant or a promotion. Up to 33% of them admitted other questionable research practices, which is, to me, shocking. Since the audience here is 99% feminine, let me show you something that you would like to read. 2/3 of the individuals found committed frauds were male. This exceeds by far the overall proportion of males, particularly among life science workers. So maybe since you are all female here, you will be proud of reading this last sentence here. If you've seen already, how to deal with cases of fraud when the fraud is really proven. Most cases of fraud are handled internationally by universities with the revocation of the title of the culprit and or with the loss of his academic position. Most institutions now have guidelines to handle the cases of fraud. It is generally felt that the punishment they inflict, internal punishment, are adequate. And the civic community is reluctant to accept that external powers, the judiciary power, enters the laboratories to control experiments or intervene in cases that only concern career advancements or that only temporarily gratify researchers who are actually psychologically not normal. These interventions in the judiciary are, however, they are seen as a dangerous attempt to interfere with the freedom of research. However, the case is different when, as I told you, when the results of the fraud have consequences that affect the general community. Obviously, in such cases, the judicial power must intervene and impose sanctions other than the intervention, the internal sanction by the university. But the situation is not clear. What can we do? Identify all the authors and verify their consent to publication when you receive a paper as an editor, for example. Ask what each author specifies, that the author specifies his, her role in the work. Some journals already do that. For example, if we had the second point, check the track record of the publication of each author. One mistake which we did in the paper of the 5 Greek authors, and I admit our guilt there, we did not check the track record of the authors, which was non-existing. See, I understand that was a mistake, but our journal receives about 10,000 papers each year. It is impossible to check the track record of each of the authors, especially in China. There are millions of people with the same name, and it's difficult to find out. If we had been more careful, I apologize for that, but it was impossible to do otherwise. We would have found out that this Greek author didn't exist. Develop softwares, algorithms to uncover fraud, and some algorithms now and some softwares are available, and now it is much more difficult to commit obvious cases of fraud. Especially revise the evaluation criteria in allocation, funding, award, promotions, which are now based mostly on bibliometric indices, the famous impact factor, as you all know. The Declaration of San Francisco, initiated by the American Society of Cell Biology and originally signed in 2012 by 155 scientists on behalf of the 78 most important worldwide scientific organizations, proposes to abolish these indices as evaluation criteria. Certainly, bibliometric analysis has now gone too far, and certainly correction is important there. The National Center for Publication Information at the NIH has set up a website, PubMed Commons, where each researcher may comment on articles listed in PubMed, like Scopus or Google, for example. And especially the ORCID system. This is the ORCID system. It is an archive. It's like, you know, you have go to supermarket, buy something. There is I don't know how to call it, the internet label on that, and you can immediately identify what you are buying. This is something similar. An archive that unique identifies for all, free of charge. One only needs to register to obtain the identifier. The authors of article must provide their own identification code when submitted the paper to a journal. Now it's becoming not obligatory yet, but very, very common. It doesn't solve the problem of anonyms. Of course, there are in China a lot of people call Wang, for example, or so many people call Rossi in Italy, and so on and so forth. That is not solved by that, but it helps. Honestly, we still don't know how to deal in a conclusive way with frauds and other fraudulent behaviors. We are improving, but basically there are some general themes that change in science to abolish this plague which we have of scientific misconduct. I think I finished. I have to thank you, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you a lot, Professor Carafoli. Can you hear me? Yes? Do you hear my voice? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for your very compelling presentation, full of so much interesting, albeit a little bit discouraging information. We now have some time for a few questions. Please, I have given some information below in the chat regarding how to ask questions. If you want, you can just write the word question in the chat, and then we'll give you the stage for asking it. If you prefer, you can write your question together with the word question, and we'll write it aloud. We'll read it aloud to Professor Carafoli. And if you're a PhD student, write it down, because your question will be asked before the others. And I don't know if there are questions now in the room, maybe Massimo?
Avete qualche domanda? Do you have any question for Professor Carafoli, maybe? Prego.
If you think that you're working in a research and there is the researchers are conducting a fraud, if you realize that you're working in a research like this, what would you do if you're an assistant in a research like this?
That's a deep question.
I repeat the question for the audience on Zoom. If you found out that one of your colleagues is actually doing some fraud, what would you do?
Difficult question, but a question which is correct in an audience of psychologists. It has happened to me once. I have a long career. Happened to me once, and the motivation and the person who did that was one of my best students. It was in Switzerland, not in Italy. And as a matter of fact, when I told him, why have you done it? The guy started crying. And he was in a terrible shape. And he says, I felt inadequate. I wanted to please you. I wanted to make sure that you liked my results, and so on and so forth. So that is a motivation which, in my opinion, very common psychologically. You know, most of people who commit fraud in the young age, when they are still young students, postdocs, are incapable of real criminal behavior in the vast majority. They are weak people who have a type of motivation, you see? And what can I say? Of course, I try to explain to him that he did not have to please me, which is he has to please truth and actually science, not me. But what do you do when somebody starts crying and says, please forgive me, and so on and forth? What can you do? I don't know what happened to him. I kept him working with me until he became a PhD. And then he went, well, I don't know anything about him or her. I didn't say it was a female or a man. And that is a very difficult situation, because one feels guilty, you see, because one feels, I felt guilty. Maybe I gave them the impression, by putting pressure on them, that I had this idea, this should be the right results, and they did all they could to prove me right. You see, so it's not that I was unaware that I had applied pressure, but evidently I did with this poor person. You see, so what can I answer? Your question is impossible to answer. I never had to do personally with criminal behavior. But with this, excusable, if you want, if I may say so, I don't know whether you will excuse it, you're psychologists, but personally I felt sorry for the poor person.
Now there are some questions, but I think we have not so much time, so I just read one aloud. And let's see. This is: do you think that scientific fraud may be hindered through alternative forms of publication, like registered reports, where the paper is accepted in principle before the study is conducted? And on the other side, how preprints may impact on scientific fraud?
Well, the first question is easy to answer. You're right. You're perfectly right. All this has happened because of the COVID, because of the pandemic. There was no such a thing in the, say, 3, 4, 5 years ago as dozens, hundreds of journals that publish results because of the urgency of the emergency situation. All of them, nearly all of them on the viral pandemic, describing results which are preliminary, which are actually not tested in the right way. As a matter of fact, you can see quite clearly in the few cases in which these ahead of print publications are accepted. When they are accepted, the real journal later on, you read the original paper, the one that has been sent ahead of a before peer, in other words, and then the final copy, they're totally different. So that is a negative thing. But what is wrong is that I've seen it personally in the CVs, in the curricula of persons who have published these things. Sometimes you see the two papers, the one which was the preliminary one without peer review, and the regular one with different title, but the same result, more or less. So it's a way, in a sense, which is actually dishonest, unhonest, not honest, to multiply your own publications, in a sense. But this has only been so in the last 2 or 3 years. Now, what's your second question? I forgot now.
Second one was whether using the what would be the impact of preprints on scientific fraud?
Right now, more it has to do with essentially the pandemic, a tremendous impact. I would say the vast majority of the papers you read now are ahead of print publications. It will disappear. Once we are back again in real life, this thing will disappear, obviously. At the moment, you are right. There is a tremendous predominance of ahead of print publications.
I don't know if we do have the time for one last question from a PhD student who is asking, I was wondering which other metrics the 155 scientists proposed to evaluate researchers and research instead of the bibliometric ones.
See, first of all, bibliometry is important. But one thing is to be said at the very beginning. The mythical impact factor is not an evaluation of the researcher, evaluates journals. So there is this incredible error, original error, thinking that a student so-and-so has an impact factor or whatever. That is wrong. Nevertheless, now is widely accepted as a rule. I think personally, I believe that peer reviewing is essential. We all know that. Is adequate, is an index. Journals are correct when they want to have a high impact factor because they publish very good papers. But there are countries, Italy is one, unfortunately, in which you have pushed the bibliometry to the 4th or 5th quartile, not only say 15, no, 15,8, 9, 6, 7, 8. It's incredible. It is exaggerated. Bibliometry now, personally, many of us, I'm one, are convinced that promotions, degrees, positions have to rest on the interview of the candidate, not the fact that he says, I published 5 papers in Nature or Science or whatever. but the rules are difficult to dismantle. Italy now is increasing in this respect, but still there are grotesque examples of importance given to the 4 to 5 decimal in impact factors in the evaluation of individuals.